Hey everyone, my name is Paul and today I'm replacing the power steering pump in my RAV4. In the previous video, I replaced the cylinder head in my RAV4 and I changed the power steering pump while I was in there because the pump was bad like the rest of the parts in my car and it was easy to get to. Now, if your car is in one piece, I don't actually know which way the pump comes out. I think it goes down, but you'll have to figure that part out on your own. At least it'll be easy to see everything in this video. I only need to lift the right front corner of the RAV4. The lower control arm mount is a good place for the jack stand. Take the right front wheel off using a 21mm socket. We will need access to the front of the engine. Removing the battery will give you a lot more room to reach the power steering pump. Let's start here. Take the negative terminal off first. If the wrench touches the body, I won't get a short circuit. Take the positive terminal off second. The battery hold-down bracket also takes a 10mm socket. The front hook will come out, but the rear hook stays. Now I can remove the battery. The battery tray has 4 bolts holding it in. I will definitely be washing this. The alternator belt needs to come off first. Loosen the alternator pivot bolt with a 14mm wrench, then the adjuster bolt with a 12mm wrench. I'm using an electric impact driver to turn the adjuster and loosen the belt. Take the belt off the pulley, then remove it from under the car. The power steering pump has some of the hardest to reach bolts. Toyota has a special tool for this, but it's not available. This mountain ratcheting wrench is perfect for the job. I used a shallow 14mm socket for the lower 2 bolts on the power steering pump. I didn't have the mountain wrench when I took my car apart, so I'll demonstrate with some shitty CGI. Now that I've loosened 3 bolts, I can push the power steering pump down and take the belt off. Next up is the power steering reservoir. Its function is to dump oil all over your belts. Pull it straight up, then unhook the rear hose. This will make a mess. It's a good idea to put a cap on the reservoir and plug the hose. Pull the U-shaped hose off the solid line in the car and remove the reservoir. Cap the line and clean up the extra fluid. The 90s was a weird time for cars. They were getting better than the 80s, but still had tons of extra vacuum hoses everywhere. The RAV4 has vacuum hoses connected to the power steering pump. A large hose connects to the throttle body that brings air to a metal line attached to the back of the intake manifold. There's a vacuum switch that opens when you turn the steering wheel. The switch allows a small amount of air into the intake on the timing belt side of the engine, bypassing the throttle. Basically, this creates a vacuum leak that brings your idle up anytime you turn the wheel. The RAV4 already has an idle air control valve, so this system is redundant. I'm removing it. Pull 2 hoses straight down to disconnect them, then remove the metal line from behind the intake manifold. This stuff belongs in the trash. My throttle body had 2 big hoses connected to it. One was for California emissions, the other was for power steering idle up. I'm plugging both of them. Use a 1/4-inch vacuum cap to plug the timing belt side of the intake manifold. Now it's time to remove the power steering pump. Use a 17mm socket to remove the high-pressure hose from the pump. This is a banjo fitting. Remove 2 bolts from the power steering bracket using a 14mm wrench. The main pivot bolt also takes a 14mm wrench, but doesn't come out all the way. You should have enough room to remove the pump if the battery tray is out. There's a short piece of hose I need to change now. This hose is part of the return line that brings fluid from the rack to the reservoir. Cut the hose with a knife to make it easier to remove. Install an 8-inch long piece of 3/8 inch inside diameter power steering or fuel hose. Don't use vacuum or coolant hose. There is another piece of return hose over here, but a wise man once said, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. This hose doesn't leak at all. Let's get the new power steering pump ready to go in the car. The big hose takes fluid from the reservoir and sends it into the pump. Use a 12mm socket to remove the fitting from the old pump. Use a 17mm socket to get the nut off the pulley. I used my hammer-shaped puller tool to get the pulley off the pump. I'm installing a 1/4-inch pipe thread plug where the air valve used to be. I'm sure it's metric, but this fits fine. Use Teflon tape and make it tight so it won't leak. Install a new O-ring on the fitting and bolt it onto the new power steering pump. Insert the key into the shaft and put the pulley on. I made a special tool to hold the pulley while I tighten the nut. Install the new power steering pump, but don't tighten the bolt yet. Now I can install the adjustment bracket. The bolt with the big washer goes over the slotted part of the bracket, closer to the back of the car. Leave the bolts loose enough that the pump can move. Let's pull this plug, and I need to make sure the sealing surface is clean. The power steering pump came with 2 new washers. Install one on each side of the banjo fitting. Install the line onto the pump and tighten the bolt with a 17mm wrench. Install the big hose onto the power steering pump, and don't forget the hose clamp. The reservoir just snaps into place. These hoses are a tight fit, so I'm making installation easier with dielectric grease. Make sure to buy power steering or fuel hose and not vacuum or heater hose. I'm bending the metal line away from the engine to prevent the hose from kinking. The big hose is 5/8 inch inside diameter power steering return hose. The length is 25 inches. The drive belts are next. Save yourself some work and get new belts if yours are old. The power steering belt is first. Get it around the crank pulley, then the power steering pump. Pull the pump away from the engine, then use a pry bar to tension the belt. While holding the pry bar, tighten the lower bolt. You should be able to move the belt about 1/2 inch with one finger. If you got it right, tighten the other 2 bolts. If you installed a new belt, you may have to re-tighten it after a few drives to stop it from squealing. The only thing left from my pile of parts is the left front wheel. My technique is just sit on the floor and hold the tire up with your feet. Always start the lug nuts by hand so you don't accidentally cross-thread them. Now I'm lifting the left side so I can have both wheels in the air for the next step. The power steering needs some new fluid. Fill the reservoir all the way up, then go inside the car and turn the key to unlock the steering wheel, but don't start the engine. Turn the wheel all the way left, then all the way right, several times. This will circulate power steering fluid through the pump and the rack and get the air bubbles out. I only needed to go all the way right, then left a few times. It actually works much better with the engine off. Top off the fluid, and that part is done. Let's get this car back on the ground. Now I can torque those lug nuts. If the wrench doesn't turn when you're applying 80 pounds of force, you have torqued the lug nut. Finally, let me demonstrate that the RAV4 doesn't need the power steering idle up hoses. The engine is warmed up and idling at 600 RPM, and I'm turning the steering wheel while not moving. The idle dips down just a little, but there is no problem here. With a fresh new power steering pump and hoses, I managed to get rid of a few more of the leaks that were in this RAV4. Now, it still needs diapers, but you know, we're getting there.